One of the largest ethnic groups in early Pennsylvania spoke German, but today we call their language Pennsylvania Dutch. My guest, Professor of Germanic Linguistics Mark Louden, calls Pennsylvania Dutch a truly American language. Learn why he says that and learn a little Pennsylvania Dutch to share with family and friends. Today we have an authority in the Pennsylvania Dutch language, which I am not an authority of the Pennsylvania Dutch language. I just get to participate in it in a very slight way, being that I live in Pennsylvania. But we have Dr. Mark Louden with us today. He has, I think, one of the longest titles I've ever seen for a professor. He is the professor of Alfred L. Shoemaker, J. William Fry, and Don Yoder Professor of Germanic Linguistics. I pronounce things funny. I get that criticism all the time. So, and you're a linguist, so you're going to not have fun with me with this. But he wrote a book about the Pennsylvania Dutch being an American language. And I completely agree with this. I think it's an underrated part of American history in general, and definitely a huge part of Pennsylvania history. So welcome, Mark, to the podcast. And please tell us a little bit about your book and how you got interested in the Pennsylvania Dutch language.
Sure. Thank you, Denise, so much for the invitation to be here. And even though I'm not from Pennsylvania, I spend a lot of time in Pennsylvania. I'm always excited to be able to get back. Most of the time when I'm there, I'm typically in the Lancaster area, fly into Harrisburg and spend a lot of time in Lancaster. So I'm excited to join you today. So yeah, my book appeared 7 years ago. It was in 2016. I'd been working on it for, in some ways, decades. It really is a kind of comprehensive history of the Pennsylvania Dutch language. And the title is Pennsylvania Dutch, the Story of an American Language. And even just the title itself was chosen very, very specifically because one could have said Pennsylvania German, right, rather than Pennsylvania Dutch. And we'll start with that part, because a lot of people would say, oh, Pennsylvania Dutch. Well, it has no connection to the Netherlands or Holland Dutch or whatever. So that's a misnomer. And there's a very, very widespread urban legend out there that says that Dutch is a mistranslation of the German word Deutsch, right? So that there's this kind of mythical impression that people have that German-speaking immigrants arrived in colonial Pennsylvania and were met by English speakers who asked them, probably as they were getting off the boat, like, who are you? What do you speak? And they say Deutsch, which is the Pennsylvania Dutch word for Deutsch, German. And then they say, it's Dutch. And that's completely false. If you go back and you look in a dictionary, even just the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the standard reference work, accessible online today, look up the word Dutch, right? And the first definition that's given is German, of or pertaining to the people of Germany. Archaic today, but used in some parts of the United States. It sort of fits perfectly. The word Dutch in English was used by people living in the British Isles to describe the sort of a typical kind of British thing of not having a lot of sophisticated understanding of the differences among people that live in continental Europe, but to describe what we would say is the speakers of Germanic languages who lived in what we would say is Western and Central Europe. So not Scandinavia, but in the places like, for example, the Netherlands and Belgium and Germany and Austria and Switzerland today. The term that they used was simply Dutch, right? And that's an old Germanic word that, of course, is cognate. It's related to, it comes from the same source as the German word for Deutsch. But it basically just meant, our language, right? The language or our people, right? To use by Germanic speaking peoples. And to make things a little bit more kind of fine-grained, British would refer to those people that we would say that spoke German or Dutch living in the northern areas where the elevation is relatively low, right? The landscape is flat. They were called the Low Dutch, right? So the term in English, Low Dutch, was used to describe what we would say today is the Dutch language or the Netherlandic language, as well as the German dialects that are still to this day spoken in northern Germany, which is referred to as Low German. So if you think about it, Netherlands, lowlands, low elevation, look at a topographical map of that part of Europe, and it's quite flat, right? And then as you move farther south in what we'd say is Germanic Central Europe, going into places like Bavaria and Austria and Switzerland, where the landscape is alpine, right? That was referred to as the High Dutch. So some folks are familiar with the term High German, right? High German basically is kind of shorthand for Standard German. And the reason that High German or Standard German is referred to as High German is because the Standard German language, right, that's used in media and writing and has been for centuries now, derives most closely from the High German dialects. In other words, the dialects that were spoken in areas of higher elevation in Central Europe. So it's not a misnomer to call Pennsylvania Dutch Pennsylvania German. That's accurate. But that term itself has never really been embraced by the speakers themselves. They basically have followed the 18th and early 19th century usage in English, right, of Dutch to describe themselves. So it's not, it's not a misnomer. It's not inaccuracy. It's basically just carrying on a feature of English that was, the norm in the 19th century. The word German, incidentally, is in fact a relatively late borrowing into the English language. It comes to English by way of Latin. Right.
Okay.
The Romans were talking about Germania, right? Germania. And I mean, ultimately they got the word from a Germanic root. There's no question about that. But basically the word German, Germanic, all these things, these are all Latinate words. So that's the first aspect of the title of my book is that I prefer to embrace the term that the speakers of the language themselves use. Right. And that's
I mean, that makes sense. I think that's respectful, right? If somebody calls themselves X or identifies as, like I speak this language, well, then you call it that language. You wouldn't change it to something else.
Yeah. It's like with Native American, tribal names, that sort of thing. I mean, there are some people that would say, well, you're the Delaware Indians. And they would say, well, actually, we're the Lenape people. That's our, So, as you say, it's a marker of respect, I would say.
Yeah. And so for those of us that are researching in Pennsylvania, and we have our ancestors with their Germanic surnames, they could be a speaker of Low Dutch or Pennsylvania Dutch, or they could be a High German speaker. Is that what I'm to gather from what you're saying, or was everyone speaking the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect while they were here? Okay,
so a couple of things we need to talk about. What is a dialect? What is a language? That sort of thing too.
Yeah, get me
and
straight.
we'll kind of go back to the title of the book, and the subtitle is The Story of an American Language. And I use the term American language because a lot of people refer to Pennsylvania Dutch as a German dialect. Okay. It is related to German and German dialects specifically, but it is really not, we say, mutually intelligible, certainly with Standard German. So a Standard German speaker from Europe coming over and listening to Pennsylvania Dutch will be able to pick out individual words, but not really get the gist of what people are saying, right? So it's not like, for example, British English and American English, where you'd say, oh, you can recognize that somebody is from, one place or the other, and you can understand one another pretty well, or extremely well. But that's not the case for Pennsylvania Dutch and German. So it really is structurally quite different. Why is it different? It derives from a relatively compact group of regional dialects from an area that's in southern Germany, not far southern Germany, but sort of central western Germany, that's referred to in English as the Palatinate. So we talk about, say, Palatine migration. The Palatinate was a very, very important source of German speakers migrating to North America, already starting in the earlier colonial era, actually late 17th century, to New York. So, for example, there's like New Paltz, New York, and there are folks that are familiar with early Germanic genealogical roots in North America. The earliest Germans that came to North America were Palatines that came from the Palatinate, that came to New York, and then very quickly also started coming into southeastern PA. So it's that is the Palatinate area is part of the High German dialect area, right?
Okay.
So there were no Low German speakers that were part of the colonial mix. And there were speakers from, adjacent areas. So what we refer to as the Alsace region of eastern France, which is a German-speaking area historically, Swabian area. There were some Swiss, although most of the Swiss did not come directly by way of from Switzerland to Pennsylvania. They came by way of the Platte, and some of them had been there for at least a generation or two. But by and large, the overwhelming group of German dialect speakers who came to colonial PA were from the Palatinate. And so if one can go back to the Palatinate today and find speakers of Palatine German, so not standard German speakers, but speakers of Palatine German, you definitely recognize a lot of similarities. But even there, I've had this experience frequently where I've presented in Pennsylvania Dutch to groups of Palatine German speakers today, and you realize that 250 years of separation has really left its mark, right? So again, and I've heard this expression so often, they say, I recognize every word you're saying, but I have no idea I don't understand what you're talking about.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it really is, I say it's kind of like, it's an American language because it really it's not indigenous per se to America, but it is something that is really uniquely American. You can't go to the Palatinate or somewhere in Germany and find a village where you say, aha, they're speaking Pennsylvania Dutch. So it's autonomous. And the terms dialect and language, there are no real hard and fast definitions about when a dialect stops and becomes a language. But one sort of, I think, a couple of good criteria are, first, can people of these two so-called dialects or languages understand one another well? If not, they're probably two separate languages. And second, if their mindset, right, or their kind of worldview is really sort of distinct from one another, then it's also probably going to push the needle toward calling them separate languages. And really, since the late 18th century, there's been no real contact in any kind of direct way with the descendants of these Palatine German immigrants to Pennsylvania and their cousins in Europe. It's really, this is true for lots and lots of immigrant groups in North America, where there's just not necessarily a lot of contact anymore. And so the autonomy is very much there. And you look at all the major aspects of Pennsylvania Dutch culture, like foodways, right? Like things like shoe fly pie. That's completely American. Now, yeah, there are everything is hybrid in the United States, right? In the same way that African American culture is not just simply transplanted West African cultures, right? Mm-hmm. It represents some things that are carried over from Africa, some things that are taken from, say, Euro-American cultures, some things from Native American cultures, but then the blend is unique, right? And, Pennsylvania Dutch is, in a really positive sense, a hybrid American culture.
Yeah. So the people that came over, the German speakers that came over in 1848, as they were having their kind of color revolutions over there, just uprisings, we got another wave of German-speaking immigrants because, Germany wasn't Germany until 1870. And so those folks, they spoke what language?
Great question. So the vast majority of Americans of German ancestry, and that's the highest ancestry that Americans generally claim, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of like 14%, but it's higher than English or Irish, right? Yeah. The vast majority of German immigrants who came to North America did come in the 19th century. 18th century was tiny, a drop in the bucket. To Pennsylvania, we know on the basis of ships lists, that kind of thing, about 81,000. In the 19th century, we're talking in the order of about 7 million, right? So it's large numbers, including to places like Pennsylvania. So and you're right, they started coming in about like the 1830s, the earliest, but really 1840s, and then really accelerating after the Civil War. So what were these people speaking? By and large, many of them were speaking a form of Standard German, because in that essentially 100 years or so between the high point of German-speaking immigration to Pennsylvania, which was basically late 1740s, around 1750, and then really drops off. It's just this kind of blip in the middle of the 18th century and then drops off until the American Revolution, where it just basically stopped for a couple of generations. in that 100 years, Standard German went from being a language that if you knew it, you only wrote or read or wrote it or recited it or sang it or something like that, to being a language that a variety that was actually being spoken, we'd say oralized. And so a lot of the, and many of the 19th century German immigrants were a little bit more urbane. You know, they had experienced the Enlightenment, those who had experienced, as you mentioned, the revolutions of 1848. There was a stronger sense of kind of nationalism and identity, things like the literature of Schiller and Goethe, right? The compositions of Beethoven and Bach and that sort of thing. That was completely foreign to the old stock German Americans, the Pennsylvania Dutch. And in a very, very sort of practical level, when German speakers were emigrating to North America in the 19th century, if they were interested in farming, right, if they were looking to settle in rural areas as farmers or craftspeople, they weren't settling in southeastern Pennsylvania anymore, simply because that land, rural land, was taken up. They went to the frontier, which in the 19th century was gradually moving into the Midwest. And you can just sort of follow it also with statehood. So it's like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and so forth, right? And so the German speakers that settled in Pennsylvania, I mean, there's some that were moved into rural areas, but by and large, they were a fairly urban population. So they were setting in places, you know, cities. So it's like, you know, Lancaster and Philly and Harrisburg and Allentown and Reading and so forth. And as city dwellers, they regardless of their German ancestry or anything like that, as city dwellers, they were inclined to kind of look down on the country bumpkin neighbors, right? And especially they were saying it's like what they speak is not German, right? And so there was this emerging kind of, we'd say, language ideology whereby spoken standard German was kind of put on a pedestal, and anything that sort of fell short of that, which definitely you know, regional dialects would, or things that are, you know, they're closely related to regional dialects like Pennsylvania Dutch, that they didn't, it was not they weren't really sort of positive ties there. And so there was a word in Pennsylvania Dutch that developed to describe these later German immigrants, and it's the Deutschländer, which basically means the people that are coming from Germany. And wir sind Deutsch, we are Deutsch, but Deutschländer are these kind of Germany folks, and they're different. I mean, they're kind of like us, but they're really not on our wavelength.
I love it. So that time period really made for two distinct peoples. So as genealogists, family historians, we need to realize that these are not interchangeable groups. And there's, even if you have people with a same surname or similar surnames, they're different. They don't really know each other. They might as well be from a completely different part of the world because they were. That's interesting. That's really interesting. And I don't think people realize, at least for myself, I know I don't realize, I have to get conscious of it, the time span, like when you said 100 years, it's like, you know, we tend to collapse a lot of American history together, you know, just squash it. And it's like, no, 100 years passed. That's like 3 or 4 generations. And, you know, how many people know their 4th generation ancestor? You don't. Like, a lot of people don't. You know, that person wasn't alive. You didn't have a conversation with them. And even if you did, you were a kid. You didn't, you know, you don't remember it. You know, that's really fascinating. I do have a question about this Pennsylvania Dutch, because we always associate it with the Amish and the Old Order Mennonites. Mm-hmm. And so is that the only place it was when in the 18th century, or it was more, it was spread beyond that to maybe the Reformed religion, folks with the Reformed religion, and were the Scots-Irish speaking Pennsylvania Dutch?
Great questions. Okay. Well, we're as genealogists, family historians of Pennsylvania, immigration historians, we're in a really good position about knowing pretty precisely how many people came and when on the basis of immigration records from the 18th century. As I say, the kind of important number is about 81,000. Somewhere in the order of 95% of those 81,000, we could say the founder population of Pennsylvania Dutch, were members of Lutheran and German Reformed churches. Okay. So overwhelmingly members of Protestant churches. So, for example, I'm Mennonite, and Mennonite, Amish, our churches are technically not Protestant, right? As Anabaptists, we're kind of one step removed from mainstream Protestantism, which would include like Lutheranism and the Reformed Church. But the vast majority of on the order of 95% of the early Pennsylvania Dutch population was Protestant, and the remaining 5% were members of the smaller Anabaptist and also Pietist sects, of whom the Mennonites were the most numerous. Amish were just a tiny drop in the bucket, is somewhere like maybe at most 500 immigrants out of those 81,000 that came. Then you have smaller groups like the Schwenkfelders and the Moravians, right? They were also coming in that era. Already in the 18th and 19th century, there were terms that were used to describe the Protestants versus the Anabaptists and the Pietists. And the term that still endures to this day is that to describe the larger group is the so-called church people. Not because they went to church, and everybody went to church in those days, but because they met in church buildings. Right. Okay. And actually one interesting legacy of the sort of that kind of Protestant majority was the so-called union churches that you still find in rural Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. Those are churches, there were church buildings that were shared, and to this day, to a certain extent, still, by Lutheran and now UCC German Reformed congregations. And so there was a lot of contact, but even across, and so the smaller group they're referred to as the sect people. Or now today more of the plain people, right? Also the term the fancy Dutch versus the plain Dutch, right? Because of plain dress and that sort of thing that sort of stuck.
Right.
Into the 20th century, the church people or the fancy Dutch were the majority of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers. It really is only mid 20th century that this originally very, very small subgroup of the most traditional Anabaptists, for the most part, so it's Old Order Mennonites and Old Order Amish, have really risen to become the now it's sort of inverse. It's something like probably between 95 and 97% of the active speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch are members of the old orders. Even among more we'd say so-called modern Mennonite groups, those that have shifted away from using German as their main language of worship in church, they've also moved away from using Pennsylvania Dutch as an active language. So it's really the most traditional on the spectrum of Anabaptist churches, the Pennsylvania Dutch who spoke Pennsylvania Dutch. That's the old orders. They're the ones that speak it today. So it makes perfect sense when people think of Pennsylvania Dutch, they think of Amish, Pennsylvania Dutch. It's all kind of interchangeable with one another.
That's great. So I want to take a little bit of a turn now because you're fluent in Pennsylvania Dutch. I am barely fluent in English. So, so what's something in Pennsylvania Dutch that people ask you to say often? Like maybe give us a greeting. Like if we were going to get a time machine and go back and greet our Pennsylvania ancestors, how would we have greeted them in Pennsylvania Dutch?
Okay, you would, a lot of greetings actually came from English originally. You can say, like, for example, hello, wie bist du, right? Hello, how are you? And wie bist du, it's a great example. It's the way that you can shorten it to say wie bist, use it today. This is something that's been around since really the beginning of Pennsylvania Dutch. Every single one of those three words, wie bist du, means literally how are you, are German-derived words. And yet, if you go to Germany, you could not ask somebody, say, wie bist du, and it would make sense, because that's a direct translation from English, right? Okay. So even though I could use a word like hello, which is taken directly from English. I could say something like Gute Madia, which is good morning. You can say that too, right? There's no real word for saying like good day. You say Gute Madia, right? Or Gute Uet. But wie bist du is the most common form of greeting, like how are you? And that is, even though it's wearing German clothes, it's on a model that is formed by English. And the answer would be, ich bin ziemlich gut, right? I am pretty good. If you're responding positively. And that's also what we say a loan translation from English. If you were to say, ich bin ziemlich gut in German, that would mean like, morally, I'm an upright person. I'm a good person, rather than like, it is going well for me right now.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I always thought this was a fun one because I think my great-grandmother, her surname was Heberling, but I don't know that she was necessarily fluent in Pennsylvania Dutch, but there were certain words that she use. So one of them, she would accuse us kids of rutching around, which, stop rutching, which, stop wiggling and squirming, which is such a,
that's a Pennsylvania word.
It's such a Pennsylvania word, and it's so ingrained, and like, I don't understand why everyone's not using it. It's a great word. What's some other words that families used in terms of referring to kids or relatives? Like, because maybe as genealogists, we might see these in documents or maybe just be able to humanize our ancestors, bring them to life a little bit.
Sure. So Rutsch is an excellent example of what we call a borrowing from Pennsylvania Dutch into regional Pennsylvania English. There are other words like that, to spritz, right? To spritz the flowers, right? That kind of thing. And then there are sort of direct translations that are going, we talked about translations from English into Pennsylvania Dutch. It goes the other direction too. Like, for example, what for a book is that, right? Was een boek is zo. What for a, right? What for a car do you drive, right? That kind of thing. That's a sort of classic Pennsylvania-ism. Mm-hmm. Now, there's actually one word that's entered into general American English that comes from Pennsylvania Dutch, and that is to dunk, as in like Dunkin' Donuts, right? To dunk something.
Oh, wow.
It's actually from Pennsylvania Dutch dunge, which means to immerse. Okay. The name Dunkard, right, which is one of the Anabaptist and Pietist groups, it's now referred to as the Brethren today. They were known as Dunkards, right, because they were practicing full immersion baptism, right, mm-hmm. Dunge. So every time I drive past a Dunkin' Donut, I think, hey, there we go. We've got something that's come from Pennsylvania Dutch. So Dunge would be one word there too. Yeah. Hansvast, right, is a word that's used to describe like a clown or something. Hansvastig in Pennsylvania Dutch would mean like a little rascal, that kind of thing. There are lots of expressions that in terms of like, say, like how to discipline children, like schik or schik dich scheid all. In other words, like behave yourself. Mm-hmm. Those are things that don't necessarily, may have carried over into English when maybe parents or grandparents were interacting with kids or grandkids that were no longer active speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch. Rutsch is a very good one as well.
It's my favorite. I didn't even realize it was a Pennsylvania Dutch word. I just thought it was English. I mean, it is English to me. Yeah. So
another example like that is words that come from Yiddish into English. So like schlep. That's
a great word,
right? You really, the same way with Rutsch, there's really no equivalent in English to sort of describe that, to slide, move around or something. Rutsch just, you kind of express, and it's the same thing with schlep, right? Yeah. Schlep originally meant to drag. And now it can mean to drag, but mm-hmm. it also means like to drag around, to mm-hmm. be sort of, delayed in something like that. And that, entered, not surprisingly, American English by way of New York English, where there was a large concentration of Yiddish speakers. And now I've got students in the Midwest who, have no connection to New York whatsoever and say schlep.
Schlep. Yeah, that's great. So the other question I wanted to ask you was around nicknames. And I don't know if you can talk about this, but I get the sense that our ancestors in Pennsylvania had a lot of nicknames for each other, because there's no way when you had, 6 Johns in a family and 2 Henrys that you called people by that formal name, that they had for their first name. They must have used nicknames for each other. And I've seen some, there's a YouTube channel with a couple Pennsylvania Dutch guys where they go through the nicknames that they have for each other. And they're not exactly complimentary. I mean, they're calling each other, fat, lazy, slow. Some of them are more complimentary, like, fast or smart, the equivalent in Pennsylvania Dutch. So this nicknaming of people, I'm assuming this was common, or? Yeah.
Yes, it was definitely common, not just among Pennsylvania Dutch, but sort of, in the general American population, and really Europeans the same way. It's just people just kind of worked within a very, very limited number of proper names for kids, right? It was just the idea of like being, thinking of something that is, unique or whatever, that was just not on the radar of people naming their children. They basically named their children for other relatives, members of the community. It was all about sort of conformity rather than doing something creative or new. And that's a very different kind of value in how we name our kids today, or in some cases. I mean, we sort of mark tradition. Some of the classic names are coming back, but So it was always necessary to use nicknames. And there are a couple of ways of doing it. Some of them are complimentary. Some of them are sort of lighthearted. Some of the negative ones are a little bit there too. Keep in mind that a lot of German family names are in fact coming from personal characteristics. So like gross, right, means tall, right? Klein means short, small. Kurz means short. I mean, there are a lot of family names that actually come from physical characteristics, or things like, light-haired, or, with blue eyes, or these kinds of things, or long ears, or pointy noses, or these kinds of things. Or, describing things that we would consider sort of negative aspects today. The Amish are actually a really good example of naming practices, because they still, for the most part, especially Lancaster or Pennsylvania-based Amish and older Mennonites, they typically do not go for a lot of creative, you don't find many Derricks, right? Or names that are not sort of like traditionally older New Testament names, right? Among the old orders. And so there's, you say Amos at a family reunion and you've got 15 guys turning their head around. So the one way of sort of disambiguating that is to come up with nicknames. And the nicknames are usually among the Amish, because you try to be nice to people, complimentary of things like, say Cookie John, right? So it's at some point, this guy named John, was really, fond of a particular batch of cookies or something like that. And say, oh, he's a cookie guy. He always likes going for 3 or 4 cookies, at dinner. So it's Cookie John or something like that. You also have nicknames for where people come from. So it's like, oh, living near the Conestoga Creek, right? Or Peckway or something like that, or Gordonville. Another way is to sort of use what we call like a sort of a patronymic. So it's like, I was at an old order a Mennonite wedding once, and they were announcing the names of the couples as they were coming in. And they were saying, it's like Mr. and Mrs. Ivan Martin. And there were 2 older gentlemen sitting next to me. And they said, in Pennsylvania Dutch, I said, what Ivan Martin? And they said, John's Ivan. And then the guy was still puzzled, and he goes back, he goes, Israel's John's Ivan. Right? And he goes, oh, okay. Right. And that's known among Mennonites as the Mennonite game, right? Sort of figuring out where you come from. But that's a way of kind of disambiguating the names there too. That's
oh, that's great. Oh, yeah. Now I really want that time machine to know as they're describing the descendant work. So what do you wish I had asked you about the Pennsylvania Dutch language? I find when I interview people, there's always something that I didn't ask that they want to make known to the audience of genealogists and family historians, maybe a common misconception or...
Well, for family historians, I myself am a complete genealogy junkie for myself, and actually in my work at the University of Wisconsin, I lead a research institute, the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies, which serves a lot of family historians and genealogists. As a matter of fact, tomorrow we're having a online workshop on learning to read the Old German script. Which is really necessary and a challenge for those of us that work with, especially 19th century documents. I think one thing that's important for family historians, genealogists, working with, say, primary materials to be familiar with is that literacy in the 19th century among Pennsylvania Dutch kind of involved a blend of Standard German and English, as well as influences from Pennsylvania Dutch. So you can find documents that look to be like in beautiful sort of Standard German. I mean, the penmanship is really beautiful, look to be written in Standard German. And then if you know something of Standard German, you're realizing that the spelling is very non-standard, use of vocabulary, these kinds of things are not stuff that you would find necessarily in a Standard German dictionary. It's very common for Pennsylvania Dutch speakers, especially in the first half of the 19th century, to have learned to basically kind of do their letters in German. But they weren't really learning Standard German as an active language. And so it's their kind of vernacular, their everyday Pennsylvania Dutch, that then gets basically sort of written in it's a little bit like, if you look at so-called English dialect or read Mark Twain or something like that, it's referred to as I dialect in English, where you have like, okay, this is using English letters, and this is ostensibly an English text, but it's quite different from, say, Standard English. I think that's a challenge, and realizing that no, this was not just sort of errors, that Pennsylvania Dutch is not just a collective, group of bad, it's not bad German. It's just, the norms for modern standard German really developed, late 19th century, early 20th century. So basically, when people were writing personal letters or writing information on fraktuurs, right? Birth documents and marriage documents and these kinds of things. And then Germans will look at it and say, oh my gosh, there are all these errors there. It's like, well, as long as you were understood, it really didn't make a difference how you spelled things, right? And this was true in English at the same time too, right? I did a presentation on sort of spelling variation in Pennsylvania Dutch and compared with English. And if you can find a Wikipedia page on how William Shakespeare wrote his name, and there's like a half dozen ways that the guy himself, right, was spelling his own last name. Do you have that extra E, the 2 extra E's? Do you drop it off at the S or something like that?
Right.
So I'd say it's, keep an open mind if you're working with German language documents to see, some standard German elements, some things that are no longer in modern standard German, and certain elements of Pennsylvania Dutch, and certainly English, because from the beginning, Pennsylvania Dutch speakers have always been bilingual, right? There's no such thing as a monolingual speaker of Pennsylvania Dutch, unless you're talking about a preschool age kid or something like that. So basically, English is part of the mix too.
Okay. That's great. And I love the term spelling variations. I believe in that too. There's no such thing as a misspelling in family history research. You're always open, and you're saying letters out loud to try to translate that. Like, what could that look like in written text?
Yeah.
My Strebigs was one, sometimes that was STRWICK, instead of STREIB, it's like, sometimes the B and the W, depending on that German accent. Yeah.
One thing that's also, I think, useful, kind of a tip for family historians, to sort of distinguish between folks of Pennsylvania German or Germanic ancestry from Pennsylvania whose ancestors came in the 18th century versus later in the 19th century, you find a lot more Anglicizations of German names among the old stock, so the 18th century folks. So for example, a name like Harbaugh, right? Henry Harbaugh is kind of a famous Pennsylvania Dutch author. That's anything that ends in AUGH is almost certainly Ach in German. And his family name was Herbach, right? It was originally Swiss by way of the Palatinate and that kind of thing. And it's very interesting because here I'm in the Midwest. It's a very, very Germanic place, right? 40% of the population of Wisconsin, where I live now, is of German ancestry. And you find very, very few Anglicizations. So like Schmidt becoming Smith, right? But that's much more common among folks whose German ancestry goes back to the 18th century. So if you see a name that is still very clearly German-like, German-looking, and hasn't really been Anglicized in a way, that's probably an indication that name was from a 19th century immigrant rather than an 18th century immigrant. Yeah.
My Strebigs were, they came in 1845. My Heberlings came 18th century. I mean, they were early. I haven't quite tracked them down yet. It would have been helpful if they owned some land. The records, are hard to come by if you don't have something to pass on there, and you don't have a church record. It really, then you're hoping they committed a crime. Then you're going into court
that you
records.
Can find something exactly. Or in historical newspapers. I mean, digitized newspapers. We even have, 18th century newspapers from Pennsylvania that are German language newspapers that are digitized and OCR readable too, right? So for my book, I actually relied quite a bit on digitized materials, newspapers and, Chronicling America and obviously newspapers.com through Ancestry. These are just, amazing resources for family historians.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be able to look at that image. I always love just zooming in, zooming out. You can annotate it. All the things you can't do with original documents. It's like when an archive even lets me take a photo versus making a photocopy, I'm just so thankful. I get the full color. I can see all the little marks around the edge. It's so nice.
You're right. The ability to zoom in, right, with these digital images, it's like, if we've got the image, we don't need to be sitting in the archive or in the historical societies. We can, if it's high enough resolution, we can see things that are just not really visible if we just have the book or the paper in front of us.
And I don't know if you're aware, but a lot lot of genealogical proof now is based on signatures. They'll take signatures and take the digital image and, stack them on top of each other to compare that this person that was in this time and place was in this other time and place also, because the signatures match. And you can't do that with original documents. You need that image to show to people, hey, here's, inside of all these other facts I know about these people, this is obviously the same man. It's usually a man. There's not a lot of women signing documents, across sometimes in places, but it's fantastic. It's a fantastic, the development of genealogy and digitization to help us and everything. But I did want to thank you for being on the podcast and really helping family historians, genealogists understand their past here in Pennsylvania, because we can't go up to modern day Pennsylvania Dutch speakers and say, what's your history? It takes someone from stepping a little bit outside of it to be able to describe it, because we don't know the water that we swim in, as individuals. So thank you for doing that work and recording it. And I really hope people buy your book. I'm going to link to your website too. You have a ton of articles on there and your appearances where you've shared so generously about the Pennsylvania Dutch and their language and the people. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation.